defend against in court. In India, we do see a more coned down, more specific attempt to use the law as it stands, rather than these wide, broad, sweeping penalties to confront people who are really, raising legitimate issues that make the government uncomfortable. I'll leave it to, this is a fascinating discussion, by the way. I'll leave it to the people in India to tell us whether or not this has really increased under the Modi government. Our feeling here is that it's always been a tendency within India that there is a strong conservative resistance to speech. Sometimes it seems to be growing out of the concern that there'll be social disruption, that there'll be political violence or ethnic violence if people speak too freely and sort of let their speech broaden out into hate speech. But frankly, we see India as really struggling with these issues, and I think as Karuna said, they're not doing a very good job of it. I think they're really resistant to allowing this broader speech.
Well, Rishi Majumdar, let me toss that to you then. I want to ask you to touch on sort of the broader climate for freedom of expression in India, because we have seen successful campaigns against books and against authors in India over the past couple of years, whose writings have been seen as disrespectful to Hinduism. Of course, Prime Minister Modi's government is a Hindu nationalist government.
Yes, you have seen campaigns against books and authors, but I think that what you're seeing in India for the first time, and this is a very interesting trend, is a campaign by authors and a movement in a way by authors. And they have found a very imaginative and novel way of protesting in a way. They're protesting by returning their awards. And according to me, I think one of the problems with free speech in India is, one of the issues is that how do you make it a very relevant, a wider issue? How do you take the issue of free speech in a country which is suffering from so many other issues and make it something that is relevant to the common man, so to say? And it is relevant to the common man because in a democracy it is just as relevant. Food, clothing, shelter, all these things rely on what you can learn about what your government does and how it affects you. And one thing the writers' protest has done is, I think that if the writers were protesting by, let us say, staging a protest march merely, or by writing about this, as I think one columnist had suggested that the writers should just stick to writing. And if they had done this, then this protest wouldn't have really caught on. But now finally the writers have a voice. It's being covered not just in the media, but a lot of people across the country are talking about it. And that's because the writers have found a novel way of protesting.
So in other words, you're saying that what had been sort of maybe viewed as a problem of the elite or an English-speaking elite in the cities, there's some broader awareness of it right now then. Is that fair to say?
That's right.
Well, let me turn that to you, Karuna Nundi. One of your clients in the Indian Supreme Court is this well-known global environmental group, Greenpeace. They've been sued for defamation in India. Tell us about that case. That does strike me as an interesting one.
Well, we still have criminal defamation as a provision, which is very problematic. A lot of countries have gotten rid of it.
So in other words, you face criminal charges, potential jail time for defaming someone. In many countries, that's a civil case where you might have to pay some money for defaming someone. Is that
precisely correct? So if you reduce somebody if you sort of damage somebody's reputation, not only could they take you to court for massive damages, and we are developing responses to these strategic lawsuits against public participation, but also you could go to jail for it. And the problem is that you can only bring truth as a defense after the trial started. And because our courts are quite slow, because we don't have enough judges per million, essentially, like in any other criminal case, the process is the punishment, right? So for Greenpeace, we are currently in the Supreme Court asking for the provision to be struck down as unconstitutional.
And Greenpeace was sued by a mining company, is that correct, for their activism related to environmental damage?
SR, the mining company, brought a criminal case against a Greenpeace campaigner called Priya Pillai and alleged essentially all sorts of things that she didn't say, which makes our case easier. But of course, the problem is that once she goes through the process, that even to bring those facts before the court just takes a certain amount of time. She has to get legal representation, and she has the sort of sword of Damocles of imprisonment hanging over her head. So this illustrates the problem quite well, right? Because there are various layers to lay out the problem for you. There's the existence of problematic laws. Recently, we sort of reordered online free speech to bring it closer to constitutional free speech, and the notorious Section 66A, which criminalized any speech with an electronic interface that is annoying or inconvenient, was struck down as unconstitutional by our Supreme Court. But we still have a number of laws, many of which have been inherited by the British colonial government, that still exist and that are still used. The second problem is that we don't have enough judges per million. We have about 14.5, and what's recommended is about 50 per million. And we also don't have enough police. So two things result from that. One is that when a writer or a journalist is being threatened, we don't have adequate witness protection programs or police protection to make sure that that doesn't happen, which gives non-state actors also a lot of power then. And the way courts sometimes then react is to limit the speech sometimes, and at the first instance, let me make clear, at the magistrates level or, less frequently at the sessions judge level, to limit the speech rather than deal with the mob because the mobs are too large. When these cases go up to the Supreme Court, our Supreme Court has quite a strong record in protecting free speech. But sort of these are our various problems. And when we speak of the killing of journalists, that is a problem of non-state actors and sometimes tacit support of those non-state actors by some state actors.
Well, let me turn this to Bob Dietz of the Committee to Protect Journalists. Karun and Nundi have been talking about non-state actors, this problem of impunity, and that's something that your organization has done a lot of research on in India. Tell us about the situation here. We have heard about 6 journalists being killed this year. Your group has done a lot of research over the last 10 years as to how many of these sort of local strongmen or non-state actors, if you will, actually end up, facing penalties for killing journalists.
No, I think Karuna got it right. There's a high degree of impunity for the killers of journalists in India, but frankly, there's a high degree of impunity for people who kill street fruit vendors or who kill civilians or who kill other people. That the courts are not up to the task. If just because of the numbers I think she cited were pretty telling. But also, I think there's a lack of political will very often on the part of the government to go after, to aggressively attack the cases in which journalists are killed. And you're right again that by and large the journalists being killed are in rural areas, but not always. But either rural or urban, the court system doesn't seem to be up to the task. I think the bigger. By the way, our numbers aren't as large as 6 killed this year. We only have one case confirmed and 2 cases in which we're still investigating.
So that figure of 6, it comes from the International Federation of Journalists,
That's right,
so not your group.
CPJ. Not to worry about that so much. There's also there's usually a very wide discrepancy of numbers amongst all the different groups keeping tally. Our numbers tend to be the most conservative, frankly. I think what you're seeing in India, just to broaden this discussion a bit, is a society emerging, growing rapidly, and it's trying to come to grips with the issues of communications, modern communications methods, this democratization of communication, and broadcast using all these different digital platforms rather than traditional radio. And I think the government is struggling to sort out how to control this, and whether or not it's going to be able to allow this much freer, broader flow of information. Again, what Karuna said, and Karuna, I find your responses fascinating. What Karuna said about once you finally get these cases up to the Supreme Court level, there's a generally honest attempt to resolve these things according to the Constitution. It's at the lower level where these things have to wend their way through court and make their way up there, in which the actual punishment and the deterrence occurs. This is not unique to. Sorry, this is not unique to India, but I think it's a problem that many other countries are dealing with, and it's something that's going to have to be resolved if India is really going to move ahead and become a modern industrialized nation.
Well, Rishi Majumdar, let me turn that to you then. Bob Dietz is saying that this is part of grappling with the rapid evolution of modern communication technologies. But again, if you could touch on some of these issues related to religion. I mean, we have seen that journalists have been arrested for things like writing about the nutritional benefits of beef, which is, of course, taboo for Hindus to consume. And there is a sense that part of what's going on is that there is some religious tension about what is okay to print in the media.
So, I mean, to answer your question, I don't know. Where again, English media and the metropolis is concerned, I don't know if there's a lot of religious tension there, because one can write what one wants to write, and the media there does take on the government very often. But I think that the larger question is the sort of attitude that the government has had with response to various things. So whether it is a culture minister reacting to the incident at Dadri and saying that it is an unfortunate accident. The incident at Dadri is well known, where a man was murdered because he was suspected of having beef in his house. Or whether it is the same culture minister reacting to the writers' protest saying, well, if we'll let the writers stop writing and then we will see. And that reveals a very problematic attitude, because you have to realize that here is a government and here are a lot of various elements who are being called fringe elements, but these fringe elements take their cues from what the government says. So if the government ministers and the members of parliament and the members of the party send out signals, these act as signals saying it's all right. You've had 2 rationalists murdered this year. You've had another rationalist, Narendra Modi, murdered in 2013, and despite it being over 2 years since its murder, we are still to conclusively determine who his assassins were. So in such a situation, when the government does send out, it is the responsibility of the government and the Prime Ministers to speak very clearly and send out very clear signals, so even fringe elements feel that it is not okay for them to go ahead and indulge in any sort of violence or threatening. So that would be my response, yes.
That's going to have to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Many thanks to Shubhranshu Chowdhury, Bob Dietz, Karuna Nundy, and Rishi Majumdar for coming on the program. Global Journalist executive producer is Josh Kransberg. Our associate producers this week are Javila Rashkasket, Zhu Heng, Eleni